Can LSD help us see deeper truths?
So it gets bad, it gets terrible, you have a breakthrough, and then you move into ecstatic dimensions of reality that you would not have access to otherwise.
Does the universe itself have intelligence?
The system is so intelligent and so brilliant that we don't have to suffer loss.
How do we go beyond our regular consciousness?
Reality has many levels, and at every level there's a gate.
Hi, I'm Andrea Morales. This week, psychedelic philosopher Chris Bache on 9 Questions with Eric Oliver.
Hi, this is Eric Oliver. Welcome to 9 Questions. This week's episode involves LSD, Hinduism, reincarnation, and some other ideas that may seem unfamiliar to most people, so allow me to spend a little more time than usual introducing our next guest. Chris Bache is a retired professor of religious studies from Youngstown State University in Ohio. He grew up Catholic and spent his youth studying to be a priest, but after getting a BA at Notre Dame and a Ph.D. at Brown, his spiritual quest took him in another direction. In the 1970s, he came upon a book by this Czech psychiatrist named Stan Groff. Now, Grof was one of the pioneers in transpersonal psychology, and he advocated using LSD as a vehicle for philosophical and spiritual enlightenment. Chris was intrigued, and he decided to see for himself what this was all about. Now, he'd never really done any drugs before, and when he started, I don't think he had any idea that this was going to become a 20-year journey. But it did. And now when Chris was doing LSD, he wasn't doing it for recreation or even therapy. He wasn't the kind of guy like in a tie-dye shirt spinning around in the woods. His interest was very academic and very philosophical. He would conduct his LSD experiences in a very controlled setting. It was usually his office with his wife supervising him. He'd take a very large dose of LSD, lie down for about 12 hours with headphones and an eye mask, and then just kind of follow where his mind took him. Over the course of over 70 sessions, Chris had some really intense visions that he describes in his 2018 book, LSD and the Mind of the Universe. And a lot of these visions inform his answers to my 9 questions. Now, some of these answers may sound pretty strange, and I think the best way to really understand Chris is to see him like the prophets and visionaries that show up across all of our religious traditions. Typically these are the kind of people who go out into the desert and then are out there for a long time and they have contact with God. They come back and they try to tell people what they've experienced. It's likely that many of them in the past used some kind of psychotropic plants to aid in this spirit quest. And so when you listen to Chris, you'll hear him bring up a lot of ideas that come from various religious traditions, particularly Buddhism and Hinduism and Christianity. For example, one idea that he brings up again and again is this notion that there's a pervasive intentional essence that envelops all of reality. In Hinduism, this presence is known as Brahman. In some Christian traditions, it's called God or the divine. And according to many of these traditions, we can't really see God or Brahman because we are trapped in our ordinary consciousness. This feeling of being wrapped up in an ego identity or an individual self. In Hinduism, this is called the Atman, this feeling of self, and Chris will talk about this. And he'll also describe how his work with LSD allows him to break through this Atman, this feeling of being an isolated self, and connect with Brahman, or the divine. And it's a much, much deeper consciousness. Now, Chris uses a lot of Hindu language, not because he's a Hindu, but because Hinduism was one of the few religions that actually has a vocabulary for the kinds of experiences that he was having while on the LSD. The other important thing to mention about Chris is that he himself will acknowledge that much of what he says will sound bizarre or strange or possibly even crazy. But rest assured, Chris is actually a very intelligent, lucid, and wise person. He is not somebody who is untethered from reality. If you met him on the street, you think he was really like a sober accountant or a Presbyterian minister. He doesn't come across as like this kind of hippie shaman, crazy in any way. But Chris has taken an extraordinary journey. He's a true visionary, and I think these are pretty rare these days. So I invite you to listen to Chris with an open mind and hear how somebody who has really stretched the boundaries of ordinary consciousness comes to know themselves.
By background, I'm the last person you would have thought would spend his professional life exploring and writing about LSD.
Yeah.
So.
You don't fit the role from Central Casting.
I know. God designed me to look like an accountant. It's amazing what you can get away with in a classroom if you look like an accountant.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's my story in a nutshell. I was raised in Mississippi, in Vicksburg, Mississippi, in a middle-class family, Catholic family. I had an early interest in spirituality and religion, which expressed itself by my going into the seminary when I was in high school, at a time when they still had high school seminaries. I left that. Celibacy didn't agree with me. I left that, but I got a degree in theology from Notre Dame. From there, my first love was the search for the historical Jesus. I was part of that whole movement. By the time I left Notre Dame, I was no longer Catholic. I went to Cambridge and did my master's in New Testament criticism. And I went to Brown expecting to continue that work, but actually shifted. I found that I had learned everything I needed to learn about the search for the historical Jesus. I saw where the research was going. I saw what was coming. And actually, it was the historical Jesus who was my way out of Christianity. Because in him, I encountered a spiritual presence that was larger than the institution had been able to capture. I went to Brown University, did my doctorate in philosophy of religion eventually, and did my dissertation on the logic of religious metaphor, which basically ended up with a very strong argument for the inability to use language that derives from our finite existence to adequately and logically describe the infinite. So I finished my graduate school as a dyed-in-the-wool agnostic, atheistically inclined agnostic. I had absorbed the social and scientific critique of religion in my studies. But I was very interested in Buddhism early on. I was interested in human potential. So then I got a job at Youngstown State University in a flat job market, and I kind of settled into a university which wasn't what I had seen myself working, where I had seen it. I had basically was teaching only undergraduates, no graduate program. I settled in, and within the first year, I met the work of Stan Groff. I was exploring where to take my research next after publishing, articles out of my dissertation.
Can I ask you, how did you first encounter Stan Groff's work?
I found his book, Realms of the Human Unconscious. I was basically beginning to read in transpersonal psychology, and got the journal, found Stan's work, read Realms of the Human Unconscious, and that's the book that really kind of turned my life around. Because I immediately recognized the philosophical importance of his work, not just the therapeutic or clinical importance of this work, because here's a person who represented an initiative that could give us experiential access to the deep psyche, and deeper than was conventionally thought possible in Western circles. And I immediately recognized that in my discipline, philosophy of religion, the people who would be making the most important contributions soon would be people writing out of an experiential basis, not out of a theoretical basis. And to do that, you had to not just have a few experiences, but you had to systematically do your work, because this is a very long, arduous path. So I began my work. I split my life in two. And so I had my day job, where I was a professor of religious studies, teaching the types of things and doing the things professors do. And then my night job in a very sequestered, private way, completely isolated from my university work. I began working with psychedelics, following Stan Groff's paradigm of protocol, as he published very quickly in 1980 his book LSD Psychotherapy.
I'm sorry, had you had any experience with psychedelics before this?
No, I had no experience.
So you were coming in just completely out of. I
was coming out of an Ivy League education, philosophically armed to the teeth.
Yeah.
and I just went into it. I mean, the most I had done at that time was maybe smoking a little grass, but this was 1979. Okay, so you have to put yourself back in time.
Sure.
So between 1979 and 1999, I did this work. I worked, I'll explain the protocol in a minute, but I did 73 high-dose LSD therapeutically, totally internalized sessions. I worked for 4 years. I stopped for 6 years, and then I worked for a final 10 years. Now, there are two types of therapeutic background. These were all totally internalized, totally isolated from the outside world, therapeutic engagements. I've never done psychedelics and gone to a concert, never gone psychedelics and gone for a walk in the woods. I've always was in a private room in my home or in my wife's clinical therapeutic office. My wife was my sitter. She's was a Ph.D., is a Ph.D. in clinical psychology. Always working isolated, lying down, wearing eye shades, and with headphones and music carefully calibrated in order to pace the unfolding and to support the deep unfolding that takes place. Now, there are two therapeutic protocols: low-dose psycholytic therapy or high-dose psychedelic therapy. Low-dose psycholytic therapy activates, my understanding, and I think our understanding of LSD is the substance I chose to work with because that was the one Stan had done most of his research on. That was the one that, it was his research that convinced me of the safety and the utility of this practice. And again, this was before the age of ayahuasca, the popularity of ayahuasca or other psychedelics that have come on the stage more recently. Low dose, these are amplifiers of the psyche. They're not hallucinogens. They amplify the psychic process. They amplify and hypersensitize one's consciousness. And how you use those hours of amplification makes all the difference in how deep you go into your own mind and into what I would call the mind of the universe. So if you stay in touch with the outside world, you get a tremendous uprushing of underneath, but you also are letting in information from outside, and you get a very complicated amalgam of experience. But if you shut out the outside world and you confront only what is arising from within, you know that anything you are confronting is coming from within or through within. And if you do that, well, if you work in low doses, you kind of peel the psyche layer by layer, confronting different resistances, issues, and basically like classical psychotherapy, but augmented and accelerated and intensified. You deal with all the things that scare you the most, that you're most ashamed of, you're most fearful of. You're clearing house.
Yeah.
Second protocol, high dose LSD psychotherapy, was developed at Spring Grove Hospital, where they were working with terminal cancer patients, and they were addressing death anxiety. And the goal was to basically not process all the levels of unfinished business at the personal psyche, but to sort of blow through the personal psyche and to trigger something that approximated a near-death experience, to give people who were dying a taste of where they were going when they died, in order to help them relax as they basically confronted their imminent death.
Can I ask you a question on this?
Sure.
When you say low dose and high dose,
low dose could be anywhere from 150 to, say, on average about 200.
Right. But even that, not being a pharmacologist, I just know there's a tab of acid or a half tab or like a microgram. So would a high dose count as like what would commonly known as like a tab of acid? Is that the equivalent of?
Not at all. Usually, again, to know what you're taking, you would have to have it analyzed by a lab. And a tab or a piece of corner of blotter paper, it all depends on the nature of the psychedelic, the purity of the psychedelic, and the concentration. but typically a tab may be anywhere from 50 to 100 micrograms.
Okay.
But again, it really depends. You really have to get it analyzed by a lab.
Sure.
High dose work starts at 300 and above. I worked at 600 micrograms, 500 to 600 micrograms. The saturation point of the body seems to be about 500 macrograms, so that you can take more, but you don't necessarily get higher.
Yeah.
So what I wanted to do was push the upper ceiling. And I did it simply because in the early stages, I was in a dual career marriage, setting aside, finding time when we could do this type of work, because it was a commitment of an entire weekend, was challenging. So I was still thinking in terms of a model of individual transformation. I was thinking in terms of a model of karma, and the Eastern traditions told me that karma was finite ultimately. There may be a lot of it from former lives, but it was finite. And I thought I could, by entering into these more intense states and confronting my shadow aggressively, very committed to confronting whatever came up that was of a disturbing nature, I would basically be able to clean out my basement, my karmic basement faster, and accelerate my spiritual awakening. I had been meditating for years by this time. I started doing TM when I was at Cambridge. I meditated, and I learned Vipassana meditation. Of course, as a professor of religious studies, I had lots of opportunities to teach courses in Buddhism and courses in comparative mysticism, and had been meditating all these years, and meditated all the way through and continuing to today. So I was thinking I could just kind of clean up my act, come to spiritual awakening faster.
Yeah.
And what I found, of course, is that all the assumptions I was making were wrong. It took me a while to figure this out. Because a personal model of transformation assumes a certain autonomy of the individual psyche, which is only partly true and partly not true. And that when you work with extremely high doses of LSD in this manner, you produce a state of heightened consciousness, which very quickly shatters the boundaries of the private mind and opens up into larger fields of consciousness, dimensions of the collective psyche. And so at some point in my work, after a few years, literally the patient shifted from being me in any private sense to being some aspect of humanity at large, some aspect of the collective psyche of humanity. And that's really what, working that out and figuring that out, is what lies behind my first book on psychedelics, Dark Night, Early Dawn. Where I really presented that proposal and worked it out in terms of transpersonal theory.
Right.
So basically, I dug in. I had my day job. I did this work for 20 years, and I stopped it in 1999. And basically, 20 years later, I wrote LSD in the Mind of the Universe, or I published LSD in the Mind of the Universe.
And could you explain a little bit what motivated you to stop at that point?
Well, as always, it's hard. I can give you the answer, but the answer really won't make much sense until you have more of the story leading up to it. Because my work was unusual in several respects. First of all, I was working with exceptionally high doses, working with it in a very disciplined, confined manner, working as a philosopher, not a therapist. I recorded all my sessions within 24 hours, and the precision and commitment to accurate recall and evaluating and assessing on an ongoing basis what was happening in my sessions changed the caliber of confrontation that took place and deepened the nature of the initiation and deepened the nature of the communion that took place. So when you do this, you go through a deep, not just ego death, which is most commonly discussed in the therapeutic literature, But ego death is just the first of a series of deaths that one goes through as you go deeper and deeper into a consciousness which is so large and so vast, one struggles what to call it.
Sure.
I call it the mind of the universe. You could call it any number of things. I tend to shy away from God language because God carries so many social distortions, and the nature of my journey led me to see how profoundly limited and historically conditioned the various religions of the world are.
Sure. I'd like to have on conversation, because I was fascinated in reading your book. You've had these really deep and remarkable experiences, and I I appreciate the challenge of then translating those experiences into ordinary language. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. And one of the things that's also challenging for me is I have my own interpretive framework of reality and how the world works, and it's very much informed by probably a more scientific-based understanding. And when I'm reading your experiences and I'm reading your interpretations of your experiences, and I'm trying to reconcile those things, and I'm trying to find commonalities of language and terminology to reconcile those two viewpoints, and sometimes it's challenging. And so I would like to, at some point in our conversations, because I was curious to ask you about some terminology. So, for example, death. Because to me, death typically conveys non-existence.
Yeah.
And so as you're talking about different types of death kind of going through, you know, that, you know, what does that mean as an experience relative to, I think, what might be the sort of common understanding of a term like death?
Yeah. And first, before addressing death, I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I'm a student of science, and as a university professor, I've tried to keep up with developments in science. I've taught courses in quantum theory, in philosophy. I've basically tried to sort of, from the outside, because I think non-scientists get in trouble when they try to speak of science. And so I've tried to respect my limitations, but I really tried to pay attention. And I've also, and Stan Groff, for example, in his first chapter in Beyond the Brain, I think does an excellent job integrating, showing the compatibility of deep psychedelic experience with quantum theory and the incompatibility between psychedelic experience and Newtonian theory. So there are people who have been struggling to find the common ground. Irvin Laszlo is one example of someone who is extremely proficient in the sciences and also proficient in psychedelic experience and transpersonal psychology, and he is working that common ground. So I attend to them, but in this particular, in my writing, I have not tried to include all the aspects of those discussions. I haven't included the correlations that one could draw, for example, with the mystical traditions or that literature, because it was so demanding, and just provide a phenomenologically adequate description of the experiential territory. That was my sole project. Other discussions follow from that project. But my goal was just to describe where it went and the minimum scaffolding that seemed to be required to do intellectual justice to where it went. Back to death. Of course, our culture, which believes that matter is the only thing that exists and matter is the only thing that's real, so that when we die physically, we cease to exist. I mean, that's just logical. That makes perfect sense. But what you find in this work is that physical reality is not the only reality, and that there are other dimensions of reality that it rests upon. I mean, even physicists now, right? Dark energy, dark matter and multidimensional superstring theory are looking at multidimensions of reality, but experientially, you learn that when one dies inside time and space, consciousness doesn't cease to exist, but it, in a sense, transitions into other dimensions of reality, which are structured, which have structured, and the adventure of life continues. In fact, once you go through more than one death, once you go through death multiple times, you learn that it's impossible to die. And the very language of death and rebirth, which is the language which you know that I use in LSD and the Mind of the Universe, even that language, you have to find a new language, because every time you die, you always wake up in a different reality as a different being, kind of being, but with continuity of awareness with your earthly existence. And that's
so.
where I understand that.
Can you describe a death experience in a little bit more detail, like it sounds like it's very difficult to translate into ordinary language, because you are moving into a different reality space, or a different sort of, coexistence in reality, or you're coexisting with a different feeling of reality or sense of reality.
Yeah.
But is there? Can you at least describe that a little bit?
It's difficult to describe in the beginning, but it's not difficult to describe with practice. When you first a broader theoretical point, and then back to the death experience. When you are catapulted through a death and rebirth experience and wake up in a different level of reality, your mind often has a great deal of difficulty staying cognitively competent in this new environment, because you don't have any reference points for how to process the experiences that you have. And I think it's this kind of cognitive confusion which lies behind the widespread use of ineffability as one of the markers of mystical experience. You can't describe it. Mm-hmm. But my experience has been that if you go back consistently and rigorously using the same protocol back into the same state of consciousness, what happens is your mind learns how to stay conscious in levels that it had previously could not stay conscious in. You learn how to stay cognitively coherent. You learn how reality functions then, and you learn how to be able to describe it. And so one of the reasons it took me so many years between stopping my sessions and writing LSD in the Mind of the Universe is because I not only spent years recording the experiences rigorously as I could, but it took me years to process them and put the pieces together and figure out how they related to one another, what the narrative storyline was. So back to death and rebirth. The fundamental nature of death and rebirth is consistent even as it moves into deeper levels of reality. Phenomenologically, you come to a point where reality as you had known it completely dissolves, and everything you had known about yourself is completely shattered. You must let go of it. If you fight it, it can be an arduous, excruciatingly difficult process. If you yield to it, it's still scarier in hell, because you're going into a reality that you have never been, you've never known. But it requires that you completely let go of everything you have known yourself to be, everything you have known reality to be. And in that process of losing control, you die. I mean, you cease to function as the integrated center of consciousness that you had known yourself to be.
So if I can, the way I'm hearing this and the way I'm interpreting this, and so can I push this, give this back to you? So, and you can maybe tell me if I'm getting a sense of this. The way I hear this is, I think of the ego in the sense of consciousness that we carry is kind of an ordering function. It's based on a set of habits that we have, kind of cognitive patterns that we have that we use to function in the world. We have a self-conception that's a part of that. We have all sorts of stakes in that self-conception, want to feel like we're
Yeah.
a good person and whatnot, want to be liked. And we rely on that order. And one thing that psychedelics do is a lot with other kinds of spiritual traditions and other kinds of, spiritual practices you can do is breaking down those habitual orders.
Yeah.
And so, if so, when you're talking about sort of death and rebirth, to me, it sounds like what you're doing is basically just, it's like there's a calcification that we have with our kind of ego minds, and you're just smashing up the calcification, and then, and that's just kind of, then there's a lot of free flowing energy, but it could be overwhelming, and it's how to reinterpret and reintegrate this and re-understand this. Is that kind of on pace with what?
I think you're describing it accurately. The first cycle of death and rebirth, which is ego death.
Uh-huh.
You're describing ego death well. It's a complete loss of all reference points. It's breaking up the system. It's shattering the identity that you had used to coordinate this sense of self and your experience in the world. Now, what happens is when that eventually collapses, when that shatters, one moves into a way of experiencing the world, which is not from the same reference point of your previous ego. You move into a different way of experiencing the world. That, if you are organized in your work, those new experiences don't become part of your ego because your ego has been shattered, but it becomes part of a larger identity, which is incorporating trans-egoic experience and transpersonal experience. If you continue to process transpersonal experience at that next level of reality, eventually, if you have a method that's powerful enough and you use it consistently enough, you come to a point where the identity which had held the ego and these transpersonal experiences into an integrated psychological structure, that is shattered again.
Uh-huh. So by the way, when you say transpersonal, I don't know if everybody's going to know what that term means. Just so we can be clear.
Transpersonal psychology is that area of psychology which studies states of consciousness which go beyond personal reality or personal consciousness. So transpersonal psychology might study meditative consciousness or states of consciousness in which individual personal awareness is suspended or transcended in some fundamental way. Mystical states of consciousness, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, all of which are transpersonal. Personal consciousness has been transcended in some way.
Sure. And so, and the sense behind that is that it's tapping into a consciousness that's not delimited by one's own biology.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, basically, I mean, there's lots of gradients and whatnot. The ego falls away in layers. It doesn't necessarily fall away all at once. One shatters it multiple times before the scoundrel kind of lets go finally,
Yeah, well, the Buddha had this interesting story about that. It's like to dissolve the ego, it's like a bird with a silk scarf in its beak flying over a mountain. And it takes as long as it takes for that mountain to finally dissolve to a pebble. That's how long it takes to dissolve the ego.
Yeah,
Which is I always when I was told that when I was meditating, I was just like, oh God, it's true, but oh my goodness, it's really frustrating.
I think he's kind of exaggerating a little bit. I mean that was he pulled that from the Hindu attempt to describe how long a kalpa is.
Yeah.
Just in terms of a measure of history.
Yeah.
And I actually think the ego isn't that difficult to take apart when you really get right down to it. But I think we have a tendency to overstate its deep rootedness. But now when we have these amplifiers which can accelerate the excavation and of the ego and the ego's history, which goes back into former lives. Um, I think we're getting better at breaking it down faster. Now, it's tricky. I emphasize, that there's classical spiritual practice versus psychedelic practice. Psychedelic practice is the practice of temporary immersion. You're going into temporary experiences of transcendence. They're not the same as the states of they don't have the same carryover power that states of transcendence emerge in meditative or mystical practices. It's a different methodology. It's a different modality. So if we want to get into the discussion of how do these states affect your spiritual maturity or your spiritual unfolding, that's a whole level of discussion.
Sure.
I differentiate three simple uses of psychedelic, and I mean that by psychedelics, I don't mean recreational psychedelics or tripping or things. I mean the intentional shamanic use of psychedelics. One would be psychotherapeutic healing. All right, this is what the psychedelic renaissance today is really focused on, is healing the wounds of the personal psyche. The second is spiritual awakening. And you see this discussion in the book Zigzag Zen between the Buddhist community and the psychedelic community, the way in which psychedelics are useful or not useful to the classical project of spiritually awakening and enlightenment. A third project is cosmological exploration. And I differentiate these very strongly because even though I started my work with the goal of spiritual awakening, accelerating spiritual awakening, eventually my work became a project of cosmological exploration. And cosmological exploration is a different project than spiritual awakening. If I wanted to really focus on spiritual awakening, I would have worked with much lower doses and a different protocol. Cosmological exploration is catapulting yourself, dissolving yourself into the mind of the universe at deeper and deeper levels. You do not have to do that to simply wake up to who you are underneath the ego.
And do you think your approach was informed by your philosophical interest? Because that's, in a lot of ways, that's really that's a philosopher's journey. It's because it strikes me that, like, within a lot of the philosophical traditions, there is a sense of consciousness that this sort of is the vehicle, that by which we then encounter reality. Thinking going back to, it goes back to the ancient Greeks, but I think it's summed up with Descartes, and that's the kind of the Cartesian project, is using consciousness as the focal point for then exploration. And am I correct in sensing that was maybe informing your perspective on this?
In that I wouldn't want to go along with Cart, the conclusions he drew between the res mensa and the res extensa and the way he implied the metaphysics to it. Uh-huh. But basically understanding that I think the deep revolution of modern thought is appreciating that between us and the world is consciousness. Consciousness is the medium through which we know anything at all, whether it's blimps on a microscope or looking at stars, or it is the medium within which all contact is made. Once we understand that, then consciousness then has the key to our understanding of existence. Now, classically, we have understood consciousness to basically be about this size, and it's related to our physical body, and that's all there is. But in certain analytic traditions, Jungian traditions, certainly in the psychedelic traditions and the mystical traditions and the meditative traditions, what we find is that there really isn't a floor to the personal psyche. That if you go deep, you get into the personal unconscious, you get into deeper and deeper personal unconscious, maybe even to fetal experiences way, way down. But then you can keep going and you discover that there is no floor to the psyche. You drop right out of your personal mind into deeper dimensions of consciousness. And when you enter into those deeper dimensions of consciousness, you literally begin to experience reality, physical reality, and psychological reality. You begin to experience the deeper fabric of reality. I often have wished that I had a PhD in physics and a PhD in astronomy, because I would have been able to understand so much more of certain things that I was shown if I had had more technical expertise in those areas. So
although I've spoken to some physicists, and I'm not sure that's the case. The honest ones are saying, "Well, we're just as confused as you are."
But it is the case that my background is philosophy. It is religious studies. It is very much, my concern is with existential questions. I wanted to know the answers to the questions that you're asking. And so that's the wondering mind that I took in this encounter. What I encountered was an infinite intelligence that answered those questions, showed me these things, but showed me many, many more things. For every philosophical expectation that was confirmed, there were 10 that were shattered. And I write about this in a dialogue with Kenneth Ring, the near-death episode researcher and a good friend, about the trustability of deep psychedelic experiences. How do we know we're seeing something that's genuinely there and not simply the echo of our own personal psyche or even the collective psyche? And sure. I present a line of thought for thinking that it's more than just an encounter with our own conditioning.
Sure. This is great. I'm really enjoying this. I have a lot of other questions, but I think these are probably come up as we go through the 9 questions. So maybe we should switch to that. Unless there's anything more that you want to say about your personal journey in the past 20 years that would be important or relevant to our subsequent dialogue.
Well, since I've gone on public record now, I've written 2 books on psychedelic work. My first book was on reincarnation. My second book, Dark Night, Early Dawn, is about psychedelic. I think psychedelics represent a new frontier in philosophy, and that psychedelic philosophy is a different protocol for doing philosophy. It's a systematic engaging non-ordinary states and then coming back and processing and integrating one's observations into larger bodies of knowledge, including scientific knowledge. I think we're just getting started on this. So this is not somebody who's done some acid and has got some maybe curious things to say. This is simply the beginning of a long reflective tradition, which has historical precedence in the Eleusinian mystery schools, has history in the ayahuasca traditions going back 1,500 years in Brazil, in the peyote cults and mescaline in the Native American. But here we're doing it in a Western, intellectually, scientifically informed protocol. So, but the other thing I would just, but I've gone on record, I've put my experiences out, and I've made them public with great resistance on my part, because it's not easy to expose such deep dimensions of one's life in that way. And I would ask that the difficulty I have with the questions of responding to these very good questions is context, because if someone were to hear my answers to these questions without understanding the context out of which I speak, it will sound either ridiculous, extreme, and so therefore I really think it's important to place it into a particular context. Basically, in this respect, I'm a visionary shaman. And I'm an academic who's a visionary shaman. And the answers that I would give to your questions come out of this long history of disciplined psychedelic inquiry. And I know that my particular approach in this is radical. It's radical even within the psychedelic community. And I know that the answers that I would offer are going to seem radical, but to me, they're pretty straightforward.
Okay. Well, hopefully I can also maybe be a bit of a go-between.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, and that's I'm very curious to try to see where I can maybe find some bridges to.
Yeah.
I have a more, I think, just ordinary understanding of these things. So,
Yeah.
but
Good.
I'm looking forward to our our dialogue here. So,
Yeah.
all right, Chris, what are you?
As I know myself, I find myself to be a piece of what is usually called divine consciousness. I find myself as an infinite consciousness with infinite developmental potential, which incarnates and has incarnated multiple times, many times, and is continuously growing through that incarnational process. But at core, if you get to the essence of what that individual spark of existence is, what Hindus call the Atman, the essence of the individual is essentially the same as the essence of the totality. The classic Hindu statement, Atman is Brahman, that the essence of the individual is the essence of the totality. I believe that to be true. And at the same time, the classical way of understanding this is that the goal of life is for the essence of the individual to return to the totality. And I don't think that's the project at all. To return is simply one half of the cycle. The goal is not simply for the drop of water to return to the ocean. It's a much more complicated story than that. But at essence, if you use divine language or language of the divine, I would say I am a spark of divine consciousness that has been separated from the totality and is now on an adventure of individual discovery and empowerment.
And the essence of totality, when I hear something like that, I think of basically energy. And particularly when I think about what a physicist might say, it would be the totality is that everything really is just about energy, and matter is a manifestation of energy. And what we're seeing in the unfolding of the universe is an unfolding of energy taking on different properties. So is that a rough approximation by what you mean by essence of totality?
That's a good rough approximation. If we remember that all of this energy and intelligent energy emerge from somewhere, which we cannot trace back to with science, but we know it emerged from somewhere. And so the question is, from where and from what? And so for me, the totality includes source.
Uh-huh.
Okay. But
Okay.
yeah, I think energy is a fine vocabulary and approximation to describe it.
Okay. And when you say source now, given that the experiences that you have had, did you have any insights into that source?
I have had experiences of dissolving into what Stan Groff calls the metacosmic void. Other traditions call the fertile void. The reality, it seems to be experientially a reality that pre-exists before time and space, before the Big Bang. It is a domain of pure consciousness, but to call it consciousness is to profoundly understate the power of this reality, because this reality is the reality out of which the Big Bang emerges.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, one can experience that. I mean, my experience is not unique. One can experience that. One can experience it and know it to be profoundly intelligent intelligence beyond any order of reckoning. And interestingly enough, also extremely loving and compassionate in an order of love, not like human love, not like any even deity love, but just it is coherent within itself. And love is often the word that we use to describe what we might think of as the emotional quality of oneness. It is one within itself. Mm-hmm. And if it's one within itself, then and if it chooses to manifest into multiple aspects, if it unfolds into these fractal embodiments, those aspects are still one. And love is the word that we often use to describe the feelings that we have for the wholeness of life and for each other and for ourselves within that unfolding matrix.
Okay, great. Yeah. We might circle back to some of these things as we go along. I kind of, it's a non-linear series, even though there's a set of questions. Okay. The journey is not linear. What is your purpose?
Oh boy, that's a hard one, isn't it? Because my position is that reincarnation is a demonstrated fact of life, right? My first book was on reincarnation. 50 years ago, it would have been a speculative hypothesis. I think we have amassed enough hard data to move it from the theologian's table to the psychologist's table, and we can constitute a very strong empirical case that reincarnation is a fact of life. So I answer in that context.
I'm sorry, can I ask you about that? I'm curious. So like me, you were raised Roman Catholic, where reincarnation is not a sense of that. How did you come, can you describe a little bit about your journey to that conviction about reincarnation? Because I'm somebody who practices meditation, and I am very interested in a lot of Buddhist texts. I still have a very hard time wrapping my head around reincarnation. It just sits so uneasily with the rest of my worldview. And so I try to stay open to the idea of it, but also.
Sure, I understand. Really, that's where part of our education. It's not to be taken seriously. At the same time, when I met Stan Groff's work, I met Ian Stevenson's work at the University of Virginia. And it was Ian Stevenson who convinced me that there was this body of evidence that demonstrated the truth of reincarnation. He is, for all the years that he was in the Department of Personality Studies at Virginia, with good funding, he studied children, small children from around the world who had spontaneous awareness of what appeared to be their most immediate previous life. There is a small time window between when they begin to be able to speak about this, 2 years old, to most of them forget these memories by the time they're 6 years old. But if we can get to them and then systematically record their purported memories and then investigate those memories, we find that in many instances, their memories are an accurate reflection of someone who actually did historically exist. We can take these children back into the life circumstance of the purported previous personality, and they can identify people that they've never met. They know their way around a town they've never been in before. They know internal structure of homes they've never been in before. They remember details of history, family history that they've never had access to before. And Stevenson has gone to great trouble to try to identify whether these children could have come by this knowledge through natural means, through non-paranormal means. And most of the cases he's researched, he hasn't published because he doesn't think they stand up to the most critical research. But he has published about 300 such cases. He's published over a dozen books. Cumulatively, I think he's the Charles Darwin of reincarnation. Mm-hmm. Once you accept reincarnation on the basis of his empirical evidence, that gives us intellectual permission, I think, to look at another body of evidence which has a different epistemic value, and that is past life therapy. And I differentiate the different epistemic justifications and protocols in these between spontaneous recall and evoked recall in my book, Life Cycles on Reincarnation. So evoked recall, we do something to awaken memories, and we find that the memories we awaken have tremendous therapeutic leverage on our present life. So that if we, using hypnosis, or not always hypnosis, using massage or some type of sustained introspective experience, when a person uncovers traumatic memories from their past, it has a healing effect on their current issues. I don't want to say psychopathology because it may not be quite so dramatic as that, but there is a clarifying effect. Basically, by looking at hundreds and hundreds of cases of past life therapy carried out by good systematic, well-trained clinical psychologists and psychiatrists, and combining that with Ian Stevenson's work and others on these children who have spontaneous recalls, I think we have a cumulative, very strong empirical case. And I'll send you what I consider an essential reading list for reincarnation that you can pick and choose from. Sure. And then on top of that, there's all sorts of other interesting sort of sub studies in the field.
Okay, great, thank you. So maybe we can then go back to purpose here.
Okay. Here's the issue. Once you think in these terms, you look at everyone around you in the world, every human being as a reincarnating being, and Hinduism says they're not trying to accomplish the same thing. Some of them are in effect like in kindergarten, some are in the 8th grade, some are in college, and some are doing postgraduate work. Everybody is at different stages of a much, much long evolutionary trajectory. And so what might be progress for one individual would be regression for another individual. So we have to appreciate that everybody is basically working on an idiosyncratic soul purpose to their soul. And soul here simply is the name I would give to that consciousness, which is that integrates all the learning and all the experience of all the incarnations of one particular mind stream. Okay. Mm-hmm. And we could get into later what Buddhist teaching about anatta and how that's compatible and but so
it's funny because that actually sounds remarkably consistent, albeit with different language, to a lot of other traditions. So even like the classical eudaimonia, the idea of really trying to, in my term, it's sort of like, to me, it's optimizing oneself's processes. And this sort of dialectic between order and vitality that curdles within us.
Yes, absolutely. Once you have that continuity, that sort of large horizon, and then we could look at what are the models which have been proposed for what are the stages of an evolutionary development. That's a whole nother issue. But here it's just to recognize that probably anything I would say about my perception of purpose would probably reflect my agenda on my spectrum of development. And and it would be wrong to generalize that to other people who are have other projects. If we step back from there and say, well, what is it? Can we make any generalizations that apply to everybody in this developmental process? I would say, yeah, I think we can. One of them is to learn and to grow, to become more than we were, to learn, to challenge ourselves, so that at the end of our lifetime, we can do more, understand more, love more, give more, be stronger, just be more than we were when we were born. Now, if we look at questions of what is the ultimate, is there an ultimate level of that? And that gets us into the higher end of the stages. And I think it has to do with the discovery of our deeper nature underneath the surface of our egoic nature and physical nature, understanding or encountering experientially the center that's driving this entire process. So the discovery of it, the living it consciously, but then the further empowering of it, so that what we will be doing in 100,000 years is not simply doing what we're doing now with more self-awareness. Self-awareness brings self-actualization. Self-actualization brings self-empowerment. Empowerment, then we begin to look at the relationship between mind and matter, the relationship between mind and body. And the more conscious we are, the more we can actually impact our physiological processes and even the physics of life around us. Because when we look at the lives, the autobiographies of truly, what the Hindus would call mahasiddhas, great beings, beings who are not just awake, but they've been awake for multiple generations, and that they are not just awake, they are powerful beings. We find that the laws of physics tend to break down around them. They can do things that ordinary human beings can't do. Now, once you scrape off the myth and the lore and the exaggerations, you're still left with a core of beings around which there are systematic and good evidentiary reports that they can do things that they shouldn't be able to do according to the laws of physics. And just taking one example would be the taking of the rainbow body in the Vajrayana tradition, so that they not only die consciously, but they dissolve their body and take their body with them when they go, leaving only a residue of sometimes ashes or sometimes a residue of hair and fingernails.
I think this is actually, since we're on reincarnation here and purpose, I think this actually leads nicely to the next question, which is, who are you? Because I assume that question's implicated in this question of reincarnation.
Yeah, sure is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Once again, at one level, who I am is Chris Bache. And I'm just Chris Bache, and I'll die being Chris Bache. But who I am at another level is this consciousness, which has been incarnating for who knows how many centuries, and will incarnate for how many centuries yet. And this consciousness is truly an individual. I mean, it is an individuality. I think time and space is growing individuality. It's not an egoic individuality. It's nothing as small as that, but it has a history, and it knows itself as an individual, and it knows its history. And this is the identity we resume every time we die.
Well, can I ask you that there seems to be a paradox in that?
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, there is a sense of, the totality, the essence of totality, and this sense of reintegration back into this essence. But at the same time, there's this expression of individuality that's coming up in this particular consciousness. And how do you, am I right in saying that that's a bit of a paradox?
Yes and no. It's a paradox within one set of assumptions, but when you actually experience it, it becomes the most natural thing in the world. It's kind of like, imagine the image I use for anatta in Buddha, when I'm teaching Buddhism, is what I call leaf consciousness and tree consciousness. Imagine you had a tree and every leaf on the tree was individually conscious. And so you imagine a tree with 10,000 leaves, and they're having 10,000 conversations with each other, and they're talking and whatnot. And one day, one leaf ask the question, where do I come from? Where does this energy that I am come from? Where does the energy that I'm producing go? And it contracts its awareness down and finds the stem, and then by contracting it finds the branch, and it goes back in, and suddenly it goes down to the core of the tree, and it has the experience of the entire tree. And with that, it discovers what it is. It's not a separate leaf. It is a leaf, but it is the tree. It is the entire tree. And then it draws its consciousness back up into its leafness. And now it's a leaf, but it knows it's a leaf. It knows what a leaf is. Here we have an example of individual consciousness that's contextualized within a universal consciousness, a larger consciousness, and it's a both and situation. And the both and is the most natural thing in the world. The leaf will fall off at the end of the season. The tree will continue. It will give birth to more leaves. You can even deepen the metaphor to imagine the leaf kind of going into the soil and coming up into the tree again. But basically,
I think that's a great metaphor, by the way. So, I mean, I think it's a very evocative metaphor.
Yeah. I can tell you that when I have experienced dissolving into fields of consciousness which are infinite, and by virtue of being infinite, they have no end, and therefore part of the learning is to realize one will never get to the end of it. That was one of the other things, as I mentioned in the book, that I let go of, that the idea that one would get to a final state, would get to an end point. But when one is opened into that profound expanse, and then one comes back into one's ordinary state of being. And then if you go back into that and you do that multiple times over many years, the language that we would use, we might speak about every individual consciousness as a fractal manifestation of the totality consciousness, that every individual part reflects the whole. It turns out that the whole delights in engendering individual self-awareness. In fact, seems to be one of the primary projects of physical existence, is that it shatters, let's use the divine language because it's hard, we don't have a vocabulary. It shatters the wholeness of divinity into individual sparks and grows those sparks into self-awareness. And when those sparks become aware of the original source, there is a joy in that reunion that doesn't snuff out the individuality that has been nurtured for billions of years to this point. The goal is not simply, the creative intelligence didn't put all of this energy into the billions and billions of years into this trillions of galaxies simply to evolve consciousness to the point of individual self-awareness. And as soon as you become self-aware, you then go, you disappear back into the totality. I think that's an understandable cosmology, but it's a totally inadequate cosmology. It reflects a certain stage in our evolutionary development, but it's a stage that we are quickly now transcending.
Can I ask you another question about this? So when I was reading your book, you were talking about species consciousness. And there was as part of your journey in moving into a sense of species consciousness. Yeah. And one of the things I think I had difficulty in comprehending that, because to me, and this is from my readings in biology, that species boundaries are rather arbitrary. That, you know, I think, for example, we have mitochondria within us, which is, we carry within ourselves a different species. It has its own DNA. It's really remarkable that we're this amalgamation of all of really these different creatures. We're multicellular.
Yeah.
And so we exist in this way. And so even the idea of the differentiation from Homo sapiens to say any other species, I think what biology tells us is we're just all particularities of sort of a life force that, extends from bacteria all the way up to elephants and us. And it's in fungi, it's in plants.
In
And
galaxies, just take it out.
well, yeah, I know what we can see on Earth. So
Okay. All right.
this is my science mind. I'm sort of saying, okay, at least the species of what we've been able to see on
Yeah.
Earth. And so I guess I didn't, to me, then the idea of species conscious was a little confusing because
Sure.
it seemed to prioritize Homo sapiens relative to in my mind, I don't see the boundaries between us and other species as being so distinct or so great.
Absolutely. I understand that, and I affirm that. Uh, all those life forms, the mitochondria and all the life forms that make up us, and so therefore we are a city. We're not a simple thing. We are a city, and yet Eric has Eric's self-awareness. Eric's consciousness is whole and coherent, even as it is all these other things, has all these other things going on within it and going on outside of it. And it's a functional integrity that individual consciousness is. I think the same thing is true for the consciousness of a species. It's not to suggest that is a standalone consciousness, but a species consciousness of humanity is a consciousness which integrates all of the individual consciousnesses of all the human beings who not only are, but to a certain degree have ever been. But that certainly is contextualized within mammalian consciousness, within other species consciousness. Now, people ask me frequently, and many shamans, they have contact with the consciousness of other species, right? We know this in the shamanic traditions, the totems and whatnot, and my work hasn't really incorporated that. And I've thought about that a lot. My work is really centered consistently on the human psyche, the human species and beyond. And I think the reason it is because it has, just looking over the trajectory of my work, is because humanity represents the greatest danger to life on this planet. If we can wake up humanity, then all the other forms of life will be safe. And right now, they're not safe. Right now, we're extinguishing them faster than when the comet hit, however many millions of years ago. My work has really all been focused on not only healing and awakening my individual self, but healing and awakening humanity's collective self, and trying to support what I think is an evolutionary process which is accelerating and intensifying right now in history, in this century, next century, next century. If you want to experience the larger context of human consciousness, if you want to experience other species consciousness, one can aim in that direction and one can do it. And one can experience the consciousness of all the life forms on Earth, which you might call Earth consciousness. And you would have to include, of course, everything down to plate tectonics and magma flows and the whole enchilada into atmospheric conditions to envision a consciousness which holds the consciousness of all the beings of this planet. And I understand how scientifically taxing that is to articulate. But
I'd like to keep going through the questions, but then I do have this pressing thing, and I don't know if this is the right time or maybe we can bring this up later, but exactly. Okay. The term consciousness now starts to seem kind of what we commonly think of as consciousness starts to seem inadequate to what you're actually describing. But maybe we can come back to that in the context of another question. What are your dreams telling you?
Well, once again, what dreams people have, a person has, it really depends upon the level that they are living, uh, and where they are in their soul development, and the depth of spiritual work they have already done, either as a form of formal spiritual practice or just in terms of their evolutionary development over multiple incarnations. Uh, a lot of dreams are just mishmash. They're just kind of recycled fragments, just mishmash. Other dreams carry great insights that come from the personal psyche. Other dreams carry great insights that come from or through the collective psyche. Some dreams come from deeper than the collective psyche. I studied Jung in college and have always kind of, read the great old man, kept a dream journal, paid attention to my dreams. And I will tell you that when I started the psychedelic work and continued it during all these years, I stopped having personal dreams. I stopped having dreams at all. It was as if my consciousness, when I would go to sleep, would just open. And when it would open in my sleep, it would open past the personal level and past the collective level. And every once in a while, I would have dreams of a distinctly cosmic nature. There were cosmic dreams.
Were you revisiting? I mean, were you back in the same place that you were during the psychedelic experience?
I was touching some of those dimensions.
Uh-huh.
I was touching them. I would have sort of absorption dreams where I would be absorbing some of those experiences. And of course, some people practice lucid dreaming, where they become conscious in their dream and can take their dream experience into some of this territory. So to me, there's no, well, I would say after I stopped my work, about 10 years after I stopped my work, I began to once again have dreams that made sense in terms of my personal life. Once in a while would have personal dreams.
Sure. And this was a question I had also when I was reading your book, because you described the process of of taking the LSD, going into these deep states, and then coming back out again.
Yeah.
And the challenge of holding on to the experience, and in terms of then, because you took assiduous notes as you went through this, but the difficulty.
I would take notes only, never during the session.
But, I mean, yeah, afterwards, right? But it reminded me a little bit of a dream journal in the same way that we have a dream experience and then we wake up and then we try to write down our dreams. And the longer that we wait to write them down, the harder they are to recapture.
Right.
And so in the same way that dream life breaks down ordinary consciousness. And so the analogies between dream life and then your psychedelic work seemed very kind of very profound here. And maybe this is the time then that I can ask you, what exactly does consciousness mean?
Okay. Before I answer that question, let me do something.
Okay.
First, let me turn on the heat because I hope it doesn't interfere with the sound.
Okay.
But my room I turned it off, but it tends to get cold in a
Sure.
long conversation.
Sure.
And let me grab a blanket so I can be physically comfortable when
please.
I answer. Okay.
Okay, great.
Give me 1 second.
Sure thing. Hey, sweetie. I'm on a break right now. I'm recording. Oh, okay. It's okay, but just it's okay if you bring them in, but
No, I won't undo them.
okay, yeah, you could wait on that. I'll help them. Hi, sweet puppy.
Okay. It's the one drawback of this room is in the lower section of my house, and it's near my furnace. And so let me know if it becomes a problem.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not picking anything up right now, so that's great.
It hasn't kicked in yet, but I can put on sound canceling headphones if that helps. So.
Okay. I think so far we're good.
Okay. You know, there's a lot of theoretical discussion, a lot of energy that has been put into the question, what is consciousness? And in general, I have not bothered with that. So I'll give you the short answer that I work with, but I haven't bothered with it because transpersonal consciousness is not a different kind of consciousness than egoic consciousness, personality consciousness. Consciousness, breaking it down etymologically, it's conscio. Cio, knowledge, to know, and con, with. So consciousness is that with which we know. It's that with which we know anything. And so when egoic consciousness is that with which the ego knows the world, transpersonal consciousness is that which knows levels of reality beyond individual awareness. And so when I talk about species consciousness or transcendental consciousness, I'm basically using that gut intuitive sense as that with which we know anything. Now, what is this thing that allows us to know? You know, what is it? And of course, if you have a reductive materialist metaphysics, you're going to try to explain it in terms of neurophysiology and microtubules and all that kind of stuff. But that of course is an unsolved problem. How consciousness arises from within our physiology, we really don't know. And in my sense of it, it's an unknown problem. But the phenomenology of consciousness is that it is that with which we know anything. Okay. And when, of course, when you break it down in the Enlightenment traditions, you can basically clarify consciousness so deeply until you get down to the absolute clear pool, which is the source, the awareness, which is the source of all awareness, the nature of mind. Absolutely crystal clear, which is the context within which everything arises and everything returns, and is actually the content of what arises and what returns. That to me is consciousness, but of course, the Buddhists have many finely refined vocabulary to describe that. And Hindus have many finely refined vocabulary. So.
Yeah, the Buddhists are really fond of enumeration. I think I forgot how many consciousness they number.
Yes,
they like to number. They were sort of ahead of their time in terms of PowerPoint and bullet points.
Yeah.
What moves you?
What moves me?
Yeah.
Discovery. I mean, well, as soon as I said that, other things popped into my mind. But what moves me first is discovery, the desire to know and understand. I wanted to know and understand how life works at an existential level, what makes it tick. Associated with that is not simply to know for knowing's sake, but to know because it makes a difference in people's lives. So you would say to know because this kind of knowledge heals. It heals the terrible anxiety that comes from doubt and that comes from not knowing why life is the way it is, not knowing how it works, not knowing that whether there is any deeper logical structure to our existence or purpose or project to existence. To not know these things is a crushingly destructive philosophy of life. So that to me, the desire to discover what the hell is happening, how it works, how life works, what's going on, has been that's what moves me. That's what motivates me, to discover it and to share it.
Okay. I want to come back to that, but I think I'm going to come back to that in a question that's coming down the road.
Okay.
Who's writing your life's story?
Well, my life story started to be written before I was born. So Chris Bache isn't writing it. And from that perspective, Chris Bache's soul is writing it. The consciousness which made the choices that shaped the reality of Chris Bache's incarnation, or the incarnation that was called Chris Bache. So my understanding is that there is a choice which is made by my soul before I was born to incarnate in this genetic matrix at this point in history, in this family constellation, and to be, that will allow me to continue my developmental journey in an advantageous way. Now, once I'm here, I'm responsible for my story. I mean, I take responsibility for grabbing the steering wheel and maximizing its potential. But at a deeper level, just as my individual health depends upon the health of my environment, and the air that's inside my lungs depends upon the air which is outside my body. Likewise, my personal psyche is contextualized within the psyche of my species. So while I take responsibility for driving my individual system, I understand that the way I understand it is that my mind is a fractal embodiment of a consciousness that runs through my species. And my body literally is a distillation of patterns which run throughout my species. So my species has an influence on my mind and my body. And the whole evolutionary thrust that's manifesting itself as emergent life and emergent consciousness on this planet has a hand on my mind and my body. So most immediately, I would say I do. Behind that, I would say my soul is writing the story. And then at a larger level, that which is driving evolution is writing the story.
Do you, this might count as a personal question, and if you don't want to answer it, that's fine.
Sure.
But I'm curious, in your explorations, did you have moments of realization of past incarnations?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and even before, when I stopped my work for that 6-year period, I did 3 years of past life therapy to explore my former lives. And I made contact with about a dozen of them, worked with a dozen of them over time. And I had contact with a couple of former lives in my psychedelic experience.
And what was that? And what was that experience like for you? I'm having once again, this is really outside of my realm of understanding. Yeah. So I'm curious so I'm imagining, like, if I had something like that, what would that be like? What would that mean?
Well, it manifests a bit differently in a hypnotherapeutic context than it does necessarily in a psychedelic context. So let me describe the process in the psychedelic context. and I'm not going to do it by describing the content of the life itself, but there was a processing of, well, let me back up. The emergence of a memory. The emergence of a memory that was very specific, very concrete, but did not belong to this century. A memory of a traumatic encounter between two people in an historical dance. And then as that plot unfolded, I saw my current life simultaneous with that past life. And I saw my present incarnation and my relationships with this same being, with this same being superimposed against this memory that was coming from somewhere back in the Middle Ages. And it suddenly, everything made sense down to the closest detail. Why my present relationship with this person had been so complicated and so problematic, with positive and negative aspects, made suddenly transparent sense given the uncovering of that earlier history. And in that earlier history, becoming conscious and becoming integrated and reconciled, it changed the dynamics of my present relationships with this person. Didn't make it instantly. But
so you had a moment, it was, if I'm going to translate this and tell me if I'm getting this wrong,
yeah.
But it is a sense of within your current incarnation and consciousness, you're also carrying the legacy of this past incarnation and this past traumatic experience. And, and that is affecting your current reality in ways that are not necessarily always obvious to ordinary consciousness. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
We have stories about, we tell ourselves, why am I the way I am? And we tell stories, and some of our stories go back to family conditioning, and certainly there's truth there. Some of our stories go into genetics, and certainly there's a truth there. But if you work with mind, just with mind, and you follow aspects of your mind into your mind, you find out that nothing comes from nowhere. Anything which is part of your life comes from somewhere. And it's not just that problematic relationships or problematic issues that I'm dealing with come from somewhere, but assets, things that are we would say natural abilities in my life come from somewhere. Everything comes from somewhere. And from my view, it's not that all of my former lives are dynamically present in this present incarnation. The way I understand it, it's kind of like playing cards. There may be 52 cards in the deck, but a hand is only holding 5 or 6 cards. There are only a limited number of former lives that have been dynamically brought forward and integrated to constellate the issues that are dynamic in my present life. The rest of my former lives, for the most part, are in the background and kind of in the cheap bleacher seats.
Mm-hmm.
Only a small number are in the foreground and are dynamically involved in my present life. And so I work within a dynamic system that has a larger history. And the choices which I am making and how I work my life out, I believe has ramifications that spread into my future history.
Okay. Sorry, someone is calling me here and I'm going to decline. Okay, sorry. All right. Next question.
Yeah.
Which is, it's kind of funny now to ask this question relative to the conversation we've been having, but do you own your shit or does your shit own you?
Oh, I like that question. When I read it, I thought, here's my answer. It all depends on how well you wipe your ass. If you're cleaning up your business as you go along, then your shit doesn't own you.
Uh-huh.
But if you're not cleaning it up, it owns you. Yeah.
I might have to quote you on that for my book. That's perfect.
But you know, it's true, isn't it? The less self-aware we are, the less aware we are, the more our unconscious processes control us. The more aware we are, the more aware we are of those processes, the less control they have over us. And if we engage the shadow gets weaker. And if we don't engage the shadow gets stronger. Mm-hmm. So it's a very simple relationship in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you, given all the work that you've done, do you still feel that there's more work for you to do? Maybe put it this way, like, how would you describe your, in terms of, okay, we're what more of your ass do you still have to wipe?
Well, you know, that's a question that's best answered by my wife and my children, because they'll certainly identify.
Well, that's my other derivation. That, you know, it's very easy for other people to see your shit, and it's really hard to see your own.
Yeah. You know, again, my work was not aimed at therapeutic healing, nor was it aimed at spiritual awakening, which I understand in terms of the leaf becoming aware of the tree and living in that transparent condition so that it is aware of being a leaf and aware of being the tree at the same time, and living in the existential relaxation that brings, so that death becomes insignificant because one knows one is plugged into a much larger life process. Cosmological exploration is a different project which takes you deeper and deeper and deeper into the fabric of the universe. And as I try to be as, you know, that last chapter, Coming Off the Mountain, was the hardest chapter to write. And it took me a year just to write that chapter. And I've been continuing to reflect on that topic of integration as I've brought the book forward and as I've been, you know, speaking around it and answering people's questions. I think it is, as I was coming off the mountain, I found myself asking questions that I would not have thought were possible to ask before. And that is it possible to have too much God? Is it possible to see too much that is good for one person to see? And I think if anyone's done that, maybe I've done that. I mean, I think I went deeper into the fabric of the universe than was wise or was healthy for me to try to manage in one lifetime.
Yeah, it reminds me of some biblical passages of the blinding light of God and like, you know, that kind of searing light that it's too bright to kind of comprehend.
Yeah, but no one survives that. You see it and you die, and that happens. You see it and you die, and then when you come back to life, you still have to pick up yourself, and you still have to put on your pants, and you still have to go on living.
Yeah, Jack Kornfield has a great book about this. Like, you know, after the Enlightenment, you have to do laundry.
Yeah. Chop wood and carry water.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is even kind of taking that farther, because the project here is not awakening. The project here is to push to dissolve your consciousness so deeply you literally go to the ends of creation. And in that respect, I think I've got a hall pass for the rest of this life.
Uh-huh.
I don't feel any sense that I have something I need to accomplish or any agenda. My When I finished writing LSD in the Mind of the Universe, but to me it's always Diamonds from Heaven. That's the real name of the book. The other one's the publisher's name. But Diamonds from Heaven, when I wrote that, I felt like I had basically finished my life's work, and I had a deep sense of relaxation around that. So now in my remaining years, I'm happy to answer questions about that, or I don't have any agenda. I don't have any need to push it, to share it.
Yeah.
I'm happy just to respond to inquiries that come around it.
Can we cycle back to something?
Sure.
Because it reminded me of something that I thought about when I was reading the book. And one of the things that struck me is in the book you describe a lot of your early-ish sessions, not very beginning ones, of these really arduous experiences, where you're internalized or you're experiencing this just deep realms of pain. Yeah. And it's you describe it as first as sort of individual level pain, and then species level pain. Yeah. And what I was perplexed by is I've had some painful experiences while on psychedelics too, and I get very chastened by them, and it makes me very wary of then going back into the psychedelic space, because it's like, that was extremely painful and I was way out of control, and there's always this fear for me of scarring, like I don't want to traumatize myself. And you said earlier that you did not, you went through this. I'm trying to remember if we talked about this or I saw it on the talk, but you said that you had gone through these painful experiences without trauma. Yeah. But I was always curious, what kept you going back? I mean, it seemed that that was such a strong obstacle. And the idea is like, I'm going to know that you're going to go back into the maws of this profound anguish. As I was reading this, I was like, why did he keep doing that? So I was like, Chris, stop.
And this is, I think that caution, when you encounter something which is that destructuring and that traumatic, there's a great wisdom in stepping back from that. And I really encourage people not to do what I did. I mean, I don't know why anybody would want to climb Mount Everest, why anybody would want to go up in this, anyone would want to go to the North Pole on a dog sled. But I understand why some people do. And it's something like that in here. The goal for me was not enlightenment. The goal was, that became the goal of collective transformation, to sort of do something for the children of the world that had not yet been born. But then it became just an absolute passion to push as deeply as I could into the universe, to know it, just to know it. And what keeps it from being, what keeps you going and what keeps it from being trauma is that when you enter into this trauma, and if you are into this negative experience, and if you surrender to it and you let it take you wherever it wants to take you, even if you don't understand why and you don't understand what's happening, and you know you're threatened with the loss of your sanity. Now, a lot of people shouldn't even be getting close to this type of work, right? Because you have to be built pretty strong to be able to do this type of work. But when you do that, and when you allow yourself to be shattered, and you wake up in this other reality as this other dimensional being in domains of ecstatic bliss and cognitive ecstasy, that's what keeps it from being registered as trauma. It's a cycle. It's a purification cycle. And so I talk about it, purification unto death. So it gets bad, it gets terrible, you have a breakthrough, and then you move into ecstatic dimensions of reality that you would not have access to otherwise. what you internalize, what you take away, is the entire cycle. You take away, it gets bad, but then it gets fine. And then there are these joys which are involved. And what gives you the strength to return to the negative is the certainty that this is only a purification process. This is something that you have to go through, or something that, whether you have to go through it, something you go through in order to get access to a particular level of reality. Because it's like reality has many levels, and at every level there's a gate. And in order to become operational at that next level, you have to die to the earlier level. Mm-hmm. And so I carry no trauma from any of this. And I can listen to the music that I used in my sessions with great peace and contentment. And I can talk about any part of it, and it doesn't bother me, not because it wasn't bad, but because it led me to some place that I would not give up for anything in the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's another version of owning your shit.
Yeah.
How do you find love?
You find love by giving love. I mean, really. Mm-hmm. You give love, and love is fundamentally responding to the world, not out of an intellectual basis of oneness, but out of the deeper experience of oneness, the way that a mother loves her child, or a father loves their children, or Mahatma Gandhi loves the people, or Martin Luther King loves the people. It is an arising of the felt sense of oneness that allows you to pour yourself out. And in this mysterious way, when you love in this way, life loves you back. Life loves you back in different ways. And so to me, the way to find love is to give love.
Mm-hmm. Was this a lesson that you learned? Was it as part of your journey, or is this something that you've always known?
Probably both.
Uh-huh.
I think, I was raised in a good home, and in a very supportive home. I knew love as a child. I did not have trauma in my childhood. I had the usual ups and downs and, ins and outs with my parents, but I had good parents. And so I knew love as a child. And I've known love in my former lifetimes, so I have that deeper history to draw from. And I also have added some layers to that learning in this lifetime.
Mm-hmm. Where are you going from here?
Well, I'm 72 years old, so the diving board's getting kind of short. It took me a long time to come off the mountain. And I really have had to focus very deeply on integrating my experiences into life on Earth. And I continue this process. It very much is still a work in process for me, in progress. So I don't do psychedelics now. I've done them plenty.
Uh-huh.
I live a very grounded life. I do some teaching. I just finished a 7-week course on the Shift Network on the book. I'll do some more teaching. But basically, if people want to convene circles where we can have discussions about this type of work, I'm happy to be there. I don't feel a need to be there. Mm-hmm. So I feel kind of a deep relaxation, a contentment with where I am at this point. And I'm also delighted that every day I live is the day I get closer to death, because I'm really, really looking forward to being dead. Because I know where I'm going. I've been there many times.
Have you seen a future incarnation? Because I know in the Buddhist tradition, there are these discussions of seeing both past lives and future lives among people who have these kind of spiritual traditions.
Yeah.
Have you had that kind of vision?
I hesitate to answer that, not because I haven't had vision, but in general, I have decided to leave the choice of whether to incarnate or not to my soul when I die. I do not think an incarnation, a subsequent incarnation, is compulsory for me at this point. I think it's purely optional. And whether that's an option that this system chooses to exercise, or whether this system chooses to go on and continue to grow in spiritual reality or in other systems, that's a choice that I leave to whoever this being becomes or returns to when the body dies.
So if I want to make sure I'm interpreting that correctly, if your current ego consciousness that you're inhabiting right now is another way of saying that it's not really its choice to make, or it's beyond its pay grade to make that choice. Is that a fair characterization, that the kind of soul you describe has its own volition that really is not that sits apart from this ego time space consciousness that you and I are currently in and talking to each other?
It's a little, it's like that, but a little different. I know that if I made the choice from where I am right now, I would make the choice not to be returning, because I have so much that I am eager to explore, which, because of my psychedelic work, I believe I have the capacity to explore and have earned the right to explore. But it may be the case that once I make this transition and return to those dimensions, because I believe any place, I think with Robert Monroe, he's correct when he says, any place you have the address of, you can go when you die. And I have the address of some remarkable places, and I believe that I will be able to return to those places when I die. When I get to those places, if the system that I am at that point says, we really would like another incarnation for this, that, or the other, then I will yield to that. If I were to make it right now, I have places that I would love to explore that don't have to do with Earth and time, space. But I might change my mind.
So can I ask you a personal question on this?
Sure.
So, and this comes from a kind of a more set of my own fears of death. And one of my fears of death is this sense of loss and disconnection from all those who I love.
Oh, yeah.
And that sense of I will now not be, and it is very much situated in this ego consciousness that I have, and this, I connect with everyone through that. And so one of the things, as you're describing going on to other places, it immediately invokes in me a little sense of anxiety of like, but what about everybody else? And
all the people I love.
All the people I love, and am I leaving them behind, in some permanent states? And so would you mind speaking to that?
Sure. First, there's tremendous good news, I think, waiting for you when you die, because the system is so intelligent and so brilliant that we don't have to suffer loss, the type of loss that you might anticipate losing. My father died when I was 18. Okay. So it'd be nice to be able to see Dad when I die. I look forward to that. Even if the soul that I knew as my father had chosen to incarnate before I die, my understanding is that the large majority of a soul's consciousness does not incarnate in any one incarnation. That only a small percentage of that soul incarnates their energy, and that the majority of the soul stays conscious in spiritual reality during the incarnation. I believe that when I die, first of all, I return to my soul. So Chris Bache falls away. That which Chris Bache is part of emerges in my consciousness, and I return to my larger identity. When I were to meet my dad, I would imagine he would first present himself, as we often find in near-death episode literature. They present themselves in the face that you had known them. So I would meet my father as my father in his form. But then, with just a little bit of time, it would not be Chris Bache meeting his father. It would be Chris Bache's soul meeting his father's soul, the whole of the being meeting the whole of the being. Okay? So just within that context, it suggests a much, much larger horizon within which to understand the reconnecting that takes place in the world when we die. And I think a really, really good source for this is Michael Newton's work, Journey of Souls, Destiny of Souls. He's it's a very exceptional source of information about the structure of post-mortem existence.
Okay, great. Is there anything else that we want to talk about here?
We covered some territory. Boy,
we did.
Cover some ground.
Yeah. I have one other question for you. So one other thing I think I want to. This is not going to be on the podcast. I'm thinking of titles for each episode, and one idea I had for titles was to a sort of a 1 or 2 word description of the guest that I'm going to be talking to. And as I was thinking about a 1 or 2 word description for you, I was thinking of Stan Groff's idea of the psychonaut. But then you also described yourself as sort of a visionary shaman. And so I would like to ask from you, what would be of an accurate and good description of if I was going to entitle a podcast about you?
I don't know. Really. Eric, I don't know. People have had a hard time describing me. They don't know whether to describe me as I'm a religious studies professor, but I'm not a religious studies professor.
Yeah.
I'm a psychonaut. I use the word shamanic visionary in a careful way because shamans are healers.
Right.
Most shamanic activity is focused on healing, but I'm not. I don't work on healing a community. I'm a shamanic visionary. I've been given visions, and I don't believe these visions are primarily have been intended for my own personal consumption. But in this respect, like any deep shamanic visionary, I travel for the good of my tribe. In this case, my tribe is the whole human race. Oh.
Well, we don't have to answer this now, but if you have something that you would like me to use, and I will also say that when I come up with something, if you don't have something you want me to use and I come up with something, I'm going to run it by you first because I want to make sure that I am honoring you and I'm being accurate to a presentation. Like shamanic visionary, I don't think works because, you know, it's going to evoke in people dreadlocks and beads and things. And yeah, you know.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, somebody called me a philosophical cosmonaut. You know, people struggle to try to figure it out. And it's here's the thing. I know that what I did was unusual, but it has historical precedent. It has precedent in other cultures, and it will become more and more common in our culture now that psychedelics are coming back into acceptable scientific discussion.
Yeah.
Now that we're going to use it to heal, but as we use it to heal, we're going to discover the same thing that we discovered in the early research in the 50s and 60s, that these powerful amplifiers are not only vehicles of healing, but they are vehicles of discovery, right?
Yeah.
And we're going to discover that. So what I do now may sound exotic and be way outside the curve, but within a few generations, it's going to be not unusual at all. And people will know. I see myself as a psychedelic philosopher. I mean, I am doing philosophy in the psychedelic mode. Okay.
Maybe psychedelic philosopher is the way to go then.
Maybe that would be the way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, once again, thank you so much for making time to have this conversation with me. And this has been really delightful conversation for me, and it's just really opening and just enlightening. So
thank you for your work. Thank you for bringing light to these questions. Thank you for pressing it as far and as hard as you have, because I know your students must really appreciate you for it.
Oh, they seem to enjoy the class. So
and that's surprised.
Yeah, and part of this is trying to make that experience open to a wider public too. Yeah. So that's part of this project. So well, thank you.
Good luck trying to use what I've given you, because I know it's hard to frame. I know it's radical. I know it's outside the bounds of much discussion, but
well, I mean, and that's part of what I want. I want to give voice to a wide variety of perspectives, and that's part of what this project is, and do it in a way that is respectful and synthesizing, hopefully, and that. So I hope in our discussions I've been able to do that, and you know, and my big intent is to try to do this in as respectful manner as I possibly can too. So. Because I really
appreciate that. I'll send you a Vita just to give you some academic credentials to whatever extent that I have them.
Sure.
that may be useful to you in some way or shape or form.
Okay, great. Well, once again, thank you so much. And